I recently ran an online event for the folks at ACCELQ with two Salesforce testing experts, Julian and Regina, that talk all about how to do automation and testing of Salesforce applications that I think you're going to get a lot of value from. But before we get into it, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell to get alerted every time I release a new video. Check it out.
So today we're going to be talking about testing Salesforce. We'll be looking at some automated and manual strategies and challenges. I'll be joined by my colleague Regina. So my name is Julian Joseph. I am a Salesforce quality architect at AgentSync. We're a relatively small ISV, growing and actually hiring, by the way. I was actually formerly a senior quality engineer at Salesforce. So again, worked on a team that mostly tested managed packages. So very similar to ISV testing. And you can see some of my handles right there. And I'll go ahead and pass it on to Regina so she can intro herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Regina Garcia. I am a quality engineer at AgentSync. I have been in the industry for about 18 years. You can see my handles there, and it's really fun to be able to do this presentation.
So going to start off looking at a quick overview, and then in a minute I'll pass it on to Regina because we're going to start off on the manual side, and I'll be taking on the automated challenges and strategies. But today we're going to be looking at different testing strategies for both customers and ISVs. And so we tried to make this as general and relevant as possible for a wide base of Salesforce users. If you're familiar with managed packages and creating those, they do have some quirks and differences in them versus testing in things like sandboxes as customers. But a lot of what we've done today is we've tried to make that as general and applicable as possible to across the spectrum, whether you're an ISV or a customer. And we also tried to make this applicable to both the individual tester as well as the quality architect and somebody thinking about strategy from a higher level. And so you'll see that sprinkled into the presentation. And as I mentioned, in a minute, I'll be passing off to Regina to go over these manual testing challenges and strategies. And then a bit later on, I'm going to be highlighting and going a bit deeper into some of the automated testing challenges and strategies. Some will have overlaps and others will be a bit more specific. But in particular, we'll be looking at things like org setup, how that impacts testing, Salesforce releases, the difficulty to mock on the Salesforce platform, and then the existence or lack thereof of some of the tools that you might see in some more mature platforms, and then that we're hopefully improving upon today through ACCELQ and some of the other tools that are out there in the space. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it on to Regina so we can start talking about some of the manual testing challenges.
Hi, everyone. So today, over the manual challenges, we will be discussing how we're trying to find solutions into keeping environments in sync. Some of the blurred lines that we're coming across, unit versus functional versus integration, also declarative and developer, front end and back end, and how we're going to iron all of those out in this process. Additionally, we're going to talk about scale of the platform. Not everyone knows Salesforce, so how are we overcoming those challenges? There are many different Salesforce components and integrations that we have to learn and understand to fully get a good grasp on our manual testing. And then finally, what can we do to make sure that our test management is as clear as possible? So to begin, let's talk a little bit about how we can set up our environments or some of the struggles we're looking at when we have various environments and making each environment be utilized for a single purpose. One of the things that we're looking at integrating in AgentSync is being able to have a feature release environment, which is typically our Scratch orgs, and then have a release integration environment. With the feature environment, we are looking at being able to spin it up based on a feature or epic. So if I have 5 epics within my release, I would spin up 5 different environments to be able to focus on just the epic and the stories of that feature. I'm not testing anything else but that particular feature. When we move over to the release and integration environment, I would use that more as my full end-to-end integration test with the various different components. And then our final full sandbox package is my production-like environment, where I will be able to run full regression tests and make sure that nothing's breaking in production. So then as we continue on, keeping up with the Salesforce releases has really become troublesome for us, because we have to block out our time when Salesforce does their quarterly releases to ensure that we're not, that we do not block our testing or our releases, and that we're not causing any issues as we're trying to deploy to production as well. One of the things that we saw most recently in February was we had a spring release. We were done with our integration testing and we were getting ready to go into release it to production, but our package QA environment was stuck on one release and we were ready to move to the spring release. So that completely blocked us for about a week from moving forward. So that's one thing that we want to avoid in the future, just making sure that our timelines are matching up with their timelines to avoid any complications as we release to production. And then defining clear expectation on what environment we're deploying and what information, what feature is available per environment. We also want to make sure that as we're growing and scaling, that we're aligning our Jira tickets with the environment. So it's very simple and easy for us to see what environment we should be testing on based off of the ticket itself. And then also ensuring that we're not pushing anything into our environments that aren't PR approved, peer reviewed, so that we ensure that we're getting clean code without having additional defects found. Some of the blurred lines that we're experiencing is what's unit testing, what's functional testing, what's integration testing, and what's the right amount of coverage we should be using. Luckily for us, the sales platform already sets a standard of coverage before you can even push your code into the application. And so we already have a standard of 70% set there. However, for us, like, the real goal should be how close to 100% can we get? I want to make sure that all of our unit test coverage is meeting every single line of code that it can. We don't want to skip any unless there's absolutely no way to create unit test coverage for that area. And then also, as we start to grow out our automation, what is the right amount for functional versus integration? We don't want to test every single little item and cause our automation suites to run for hours and hours and hours. We want something quick, easy, clean, and concise. And in order to do that, you really have to narrow down your functional and integration tests to ensure that you're testing the most appropriate areas without overburdening automation. So those are some things that we're going to look into clearing up as well. And then understanding your code versus the Salesforce code. Focusing on resources that are customizations and not things that Salesforce already tests, meaning Salesforce is going to test their functionality, their application. We're going to test our application. What does AgentSync code touch? Where is AgentSync integrated? And make sure that those areas are tested. We're not going to spend time reinventing the wheel. We know that Salesforce has their testers, so we're going to let them do their job, and we're going to focus on doing our job. And that's going to include how we write our automation tests and how we continue to manually test in the future. And then finally, one of the things that I'm learning, being very new to the Salesforce platform, is just making sure that the Salesforce settings that are done on under the setup section testing those to verify how they impact the front end. There was a time, again, a couple months ago, where I ran the test on the front end. Everything looked good. I made changes. I verified on the back end those changes were made. It was all connected. But then when we went to push to production, making changes from the back end didn't influence our front end. So there was a missing piece there. And that was something that we missed within our testing. And so really understanding that when you're testing the Salesforce platform with our AgentSync app, we have to make sure that they're both tested both directions, that it's tested in both directions. All right, and then our manual strategy for scaling of the platform. Here are some things that I have learned being, again, very new to Salesforce platform and trying to get a full understanding of what this system can do. One of the things I learned is always use your trailheads. They help me ramp up super quick so that I knew exactly how to set certain things up in Salesforce and how it was going to impact my front end and my applications. Also, it helped me to understand the tools that are available in Salesforce. And it taught me, it was super easy to kind of just read the text and understand, okay, this is how you use the tool. Some of those were like the developer console and other logging tools that you can use to track issues or install run post installs so you can test it before you actually create your package. The other thing is how to scale large customers. That is one area that we are really going to have to understand fully so that we can implement the correct performance and load testing within AgentSync. As we're growing as a company, our customers are getting larger and larger. And right now we're supporting them to the best of our ability, but I can see as we start to increase the size, we're really going to have to hone in on our performance and load testing to ensure we're able to meet the speed and the data criteria that they're looking for. And then finally, in the manual strategy, we'll talk about clear test management, and that starts with product management and product management and project management, and working alongside them, making sure that we're understanding what's going into every single one of our releases, what we can automate based off of those releases, and what we're going to manually test. And with that, that means QA is participating every step of the way in the agile process, from the moment that those stories are created to being developed, peer reviewed, and then moved on to testing and closing them out. QA will be a major participant in that process. And then writing automatable test cases. So this is where I'm really going to start focusing on making sure that when I create the automation test cases for the automation team, that I am working closely with my engineer, making sure that I give them the exact data that they need. One thing we've learned is that with our data, it has to be very specific. We might need an agent that's located in Massachusetts that's licensed for health and casualty. And in that case, that is something I'm going to have to provide to Julian so that he can create the automation test case based on a user that is with that criteria. So we're going to have to be very specific in our test records and ensure that we're giving him the data he needs to be able to proceed with creating automation. And then finally, providing groups of tests for efficiency, making sure that we're grouping them into sections so that we can break down our tests in ways where if I wanted to run automation based specifically on producer details, I can actually just run that small suite and make sure that area passes successfully. I don't want everything linked. I want it to be broken up so that we're able to run any section we want at any time without having to run this large test suite. And finally, I really think that that's where ACCELQ can come in and help us with this process. One of the nice things about ACCELQ is that they provide these metrics that I can go to and look through and verify what passes, what fails, and report that up to our managers, but also look at it on a daily basis and look at areas that need improvement. And that's when we can go in and start improving our automation to meet the rest of our needs.
Great. Thanks so much, Regina. Regina's been instrumental in helping me make my life easier and getting our manual test suite updated and focused in on so I actually know what to automate. And so now we're going to be looking a little bit at the automation challenges with Salesforce and then moving on to some strategies. And so as I mentioned earlier, org setup, and I'll go into some more details about what that means. Org setup is one of those challenges when trying to test Salesforce, both from a manual and automated perspective, but definitely gets a lot more complex and risky when you don't have your org set up right and you're running tests against it and you don't know if those tests are giving you good feedback. And so this is things like limits within Salesforce, just understanding what limits occur in that testing environment. Sometimes some exist there that don't exist in production or vice versa. Knowing the shape of the org and different settings. And so this is things like state country pick lists, multi-currency. It could be even custom settings that your app is using or a third-party app that you've installed is using. And just knowing what these default settings are when you're, let's say, spinning up a test environment or trying to replicate a certain test is really crucial, again, to knowing if you are actually running a valid test. And then additionally, looking at test data. So this is kind of a larger at-scale view of, you could say, settings and things like that. But just knowing what kind of data you've generated in this environment, and again, knowing what scale it's at. We've all probably worked in something like a developer environment that has no test data, as well as one that has partial test data, and then one that is exact replication. And so Salesforce has all these environments or all these ways that you can represent this test data as well. But we need to become experts to some degree on what is in this environment, what it represents, in order to best know if our tests are running or valid. Salesforce releases. This is another area that, especially if you've been testing Salesforce, you've probably been thinking about it a lot, or if it's impacted your testing. And so there are 3 major releases a year and a ton of minor releases that are actually usually not announced. And then even in between that, there's a good number of feature, you could say, releases or requirements to enable various features. And so all of these things can impact your tests. And so we need to be aware when they are occurring. The most common thing that gets broken or changed as it relates to automation when a release occurs is locators. And so this is the front end UI changing and different, let's say, buttons or the way the button is described in the DOM layer changes. And this is, of course, going to impact, potentially even break your tests. There's a difficulty to mock within the Salesforce environment, or with the Salesforce platform, rather. You can definitely do things like, of course, create those settings or test data and kind of generate that environment. But especially when it comes to dealing with external integrations and other APIs, there are limitations or at least difficulties in regenerating and waiting for responses from APIs and validating these different tests that you have on the Salesforce side. In particular, on the unit tests, and you can't actually do a call out to an external environment. And so if you're developing a unit test or if your developers are developing these unit tests, you need to be aware that this is something that they're not going to be testing because it's just not possible to call out to these external environments. And then also just recognizing that there are relatively few tools out there to testing Salesforce. ACCELQ is one of them, of course, which is great, but there's still not this really mature layer of suite of tools. And so there's a consideration that you have to take into account of whether or not you're going to build and work on your own framework, or you're going to look to one of these other tools to get you maybe a head start in your automated testing, and just maybe even seeing how these things can be used in tandem. So now we'll talk about some of the strategies to combat these challenges. So looking at org setup, I already mentioned earlier that there's this idea of scratch orgs and sandboxes that you might be working with. And so this is something that you're going to have to make a decision about where you're going to want to automate. And for many users out there, for many orgs out there, they're probably already using sandboxes if they're a customer org. And if you're on the ISV side, you're probably thinking about either transitioning to scratch orgs or maybe you're already using scratch orgs. But really, actually, you can benefit from using a Scratch or Sandbox environment, whether you're a customer or an ISV. That's something that you need to make a determination on. But some of the things you're probably going to want to think about are, do you want to be able to quickly generate new environments and test against a lot of different kinds of environments quickly and spin them up and run automation against them and tear them down? Or are you in a situation where you actually do need to be testing in an environment that is long living? I would recommend against that if at all possible, but sometimes that is still necessary. And so that's a determination you need to make early on about where you're going to be running this automation. Another thing to look at is what tools you have from the CI/CD realm. I would say typically this lives more in a DevOps space or with a DevOps engineer. But what I've seen on the Salesforce side is really QA and quality architects do have to become versed at least somewhat in these tools, because the way that they integrate and they work with Salesforce is often pretty different and pretty unique to Salesforce. And so unless you're fortunate enough to have somebody that's really very skilled in these tools, they're still relatively rare in the space. I recommend getting some knowledge about how to work with things like GitHub Actions, Copado, Cumulus CI, which is, I'll just say, one of my personal favorites on the DevOps side with Salesforce. We actually see a screenshot here on the right-hand side of Cumulus CI, which shows this process of generating an org and running through different steps to push over different config. And so this particular tool, Cumulus CI, allows you to basically specify org setup in different steps and generate that environment. Earlier, I was mentioning things like multi-currency or state country pick lists. And so you can maybe generate an org that's just a multi-currency org using Cumulus CI and running through these different steps, even taking care of things like permissions or different layouts and views like that, and have that all automated as part of your org generation. And then, of course, run your test automation against those different environments. And then in terms of getting some knowledge on how to do this kind of CI/CD work, there's a few trails that I recommend. Definitely be sending out this presentation or at least links to some of these trails so that you can get an idea of how to, or you can learn rather, how to set up some of the CI/CD. And thankfully, Salesforce has put together trails that make it very simple to go through the steps and learn how these tools work. So on the topic of Salesforce releases, as I mentioned earlier, we have to be abreast of what is going on in Salesforce and knowing when there are these major feature changes or major releases that might impact our testing. And so part of that is just reading up and learning and knowing what's going on. And so definitely taking a look, if you haven't done so already, at Salesforce release notes. I always recommend taking at least a quick skim of release notes just to see what there is for on the automation side or what might be changing in a UI. Probably your developers and PMs are probably taking a look at some of these same release notes, but they might not have that same mindset of looking at it for how it's going to impact your test automation. Something else to note there is I have seen an increased occurrence of actually release notes specifically about test automation. So there are actually some new tools and features that even Salesforce is putting out there to make our lives easier. And then also looking at what are ways to generate pre-release environments. And so if you haven't done so already, I definitely recommend taking a look again at those release notes and some of the release articles that reference generating pre-release environments. You can both generate a sandbox pre-release environment or a scratch org environment. You actually see on the right-hand side, I have an example of if you were generating this through a scratch org. This is actually just a release parameter that you can set to preview. And this will give you the newest Salesforce release when they become available. And so what you can do, and we did this when I was working at Salesforce, so we'd run our automation against the newest pre-release environment to get an idea of what's going to break very early on. Often you can get these environments just a month after the previous release. So you're testing them pretty early on, and you can set up automation so that your tests are constantly running against this new environment so that you learn very soon and very quickly if anything is going to break before you get to that final release. And then also, as Regina mentioned earlier, we do want to be thinking about blackout dates and how this could be impacting our automation and our ability to release. Again, this is something that typically is a purview of a DevOps or maybe a release engineer. But I just, from my experience, that it's rare to have that resource available. And so getting some knowledge and understanding what it looks like when Salesforce is doing a major release, how it's releasing to your customers or to yourself, and how that's going to maybe impact your ability to need to do a blackout and prevent releasing on your own so that you don't conflict with any of those new features that are coming out. And then this is another thing I wanted to mention ACCELQ on, and just recognize that ACCELQ actually, from my experience and from what I've seen, does a lot of the work of identifying locators and different changes in the UI that Salesforce major releases will impact. And so anytime you can use a tool like this or others that are taking into account any locator changes, any changes in the UI, and doing some of that automation for you and updating things like your framework and keywords for you, definitely want to take an extra hard look at it because it can benefit you greatly. Now, I also want to talk about some of the difficulties in mocking Salesforce. And so I mentioned earlier that you can't do things like callouts within unit tests, but you can actually do that kind of operation when you're doing, let's say, a feature test outside of those unit tests with another framework. And so you can look at replicating some of those integration callouts. And then we can also, of course, work with Salesforce APIs that are native to the platform. And so Salesforce has quite a few. I listed a couple up here: REST API, Bulk API, Metadata API. These are just a few. There are even more out there. But getting a good understanding of how these APIs work, what they're capable of. So, for example, the REST API is great when you want to just modify any data within an org, or sometimes modify some settings and things like that. One great resource in the REST API is actually the composite resource, which I've got an example of on the right-hand side. Some people call it the composite API, but really it's just a resource part of the REST API. And it will actually allow you to do some even more complex operations, like creating a few resources, referencing them, and linking them with each other all in one API call. Doesn't necessarily have to be done in separate actions. And then looking at some of the other APIs, like the bulk API, as it sounds like this is for bulk data operations. So this can be used to color your environment with different kinds of data to represent different scenarios. The metadata API allows you to do various, again, even more in-depth settings changes, basically modify the environment itself from a Salesforce perspective, to do things like create custom metadata or update some custom settings, things like that. And then I also wanted to highlight just another feature of Cumulus CI, again, on the DevOps side, allowing you to do some more advanced data operations, even things like generate through a tool called Snowfakery, allow you to generate some fake data and deal with things like fake names and fake email addresses, things like that at scale, so that you can, again, color your environment and make it more realistic to be like your customers or like your end user. Also want to look at asking developers to assist with creating features that will help you to mock different things. And so I wish some of these things came out of the box with Salesforce, but they're still getting there. And so being able to mock things like a date, for example, this is actually a pretty common ask that I've had whenever we're doing something like creating a queuable job or a batch job that maybe runs on, let's say, a daily basis. And we want to be able to test, well, what if this runs a week from now? Or what if it runs in the past? that can be pretty difficult to do because you can't just change the Salesforce platform's date necessarily and expect it to operate in the same way. And even if you could, it can still be a pretty hefty ask to make some of those changes. So instead, can be a lot easier to be able to mock, let's say, a date or mock a particular setting when you're trying to test that Apex class or test that resource. But in order to do that out of the box, it's not always necessary. And so we need to talk to our developers and hopefully add that in as a feature from time to time so that we can actually test a lot easier. And so it increases our ability to test and therefore it decreases the likelihood that there's going to be a bug there. And then also looking at how can we pick an automation tool and really, I would say, even pick an entire automation strategy for ourselves and our team, knowing that there are limited tools out there. Definitely take a look at some of the tools that do exist, like ACCELQ, but also looking at how can we integrate those tools with existing frameworks or maybe customize and add in our own. And so some of the things that we want to think about when we're trying to decide what kind of tool we want to work with moving forward or whether or not we want to build our own is we want to ask ourselves some of these questions like, will we need to manually update them from release to release? And so that kind of gets back to this idea of Salesforce releases, Salesforce UI is going to be changing on a regular basis. And so do we want to be updating this on our own? Actually, I've got an example of that on the right-hand side of open source repo that I've worked on called NPSP, where our automation team would literally generate a new locators file every time a new Salesforce release came out. And so 3 times a year when tests would break, a whole new locator file would be generated and have to be pointed to, which is actually relatively elegant for what exists within the space, but it's still pretty time consuming. And so seeing if a tool does that for you can be a great benefit. And then also looking at, are the components that we're going to be reusing, are we going to be generating these on our own? And so are we, for example, going to be generating these locator files? Are we going to be reusing different button components within Salesforce? Does this tool already come with a library full of different buttons and resources and tabs that really have existed in Salesforce for quite some time? And again, are they being updated by the tool? Or are we going to have to generating our own and working with our own data set and kind of going back to reinventing the wheel there? And then looking at different ways that these tools might be integrating with CI/CD. And so I mentioned Cumulus CI, Copado. There's these DevOps-focused Salesforce tools out there that really can allow us to run our tests at scale. And so, as I mentioned earlier, you might want to generate different environments and run your tests against these different environments. Well, if you're having to do this all on your own, then you might have to look and see, how am I going to go into a GitHub action, for example, and go through all the DX commands to generate an environment. Or maybe I'm going to use something like Cumulus CI or Copado, which again has done a lot of the work for you of identifying what an environment looks like. And hopefully it's just a few settings changes before you can get up and running in your new environment. And then you can start generating these different tests. And then also thinking about, am I going to have to be parallelizing these tests? Are they going to be able to spin up, let's say, every time a developer does a commit, is it going to generate 3 environments and run them on their own? Or am I going to have to figure out a way to get these all running and maintain them over time? And then also really thinking about your team skill set. I put this at the bottom, but maybe it should be actually the first thing you should be thinking about is really how experienced, of course, you are with automation, the rest of your team is with automation, how experienced is your team with Salesforce. The reason being, these tools, again, that some of them come out of the box with a lot of this built in, a lot of these testing strategies built in, they might be taking care of a lot of the Salesforce knowledge piece of it, a lot of the automation piece of it out of the box. And so, for example, if you're not as experienced with automation or you're not looking to have that resource anytime soon, maybe you do want to go towards a tool that is automating these components is basically creating these metrics for you to view and to get a better idea of the health of your system right out of the box versus automating it on your own. Whereas if maybe you do have those skills, you might be in a place where the tool still might make sense, or you might want to kind of pair it with your existing framework and do some sort of hybrid approach. Finally, have a few more kind of wrap up tips and tricks that didn't quite fit into some of the other challenges. And also just some things I wanted to just hammer in is really thinking about always start with a good org setup. Start with that environment, knowing what's in that environment, knowing what kind of data you've created in that environment or need to generate in that environment on a regular basis. If you have a poor environment, poor scratch org, a poorly set up sandbox, and you're running tests against it, you're probably getting a lot of false positives, a lot of false negatives, and not really getting a good idea of your tests. And this is something I really wanted to hone in on, because outside of Salesforce, a lot of times you're able to locally generate these environments and locally on the fly do a lot of changes that are just more difficult and sometimes not even possible with Salesforce. You are somewhat limited on what APIs you can use. Get familiar with them, see what is available with Salesforce, and see what you can modify in terms of the environment. But there are limitations, and so we need to become knowledgeable on how you can generate an environment, how you can customize it to your needs so that the automation that you run against it is really valuable to you. Once again, also looking at understanding your code, as Regina was talking about, versus Salesforce code. I can't tell you how many times I've seen automation that is clicking buttons in Salesforce that have been tested hundreds of thousands, probably millions of times by Salesforce itself. And they are not really part of the test, but they're part of maybe setting up test data. I would say nine times out of 10, if you're generating test data through clicking buttons, there's probably an easier way to do it, unless it's your own UI. Maybe that's the one case where, if you haven't built an API for it, maybe it's not possible. But if it's Salesforce UI to generate this data and generate these tests, if it's not part of your test, don't be testing it. Look to only hone in on what is your code. Use those APIs so you can skip over just automating something that's going to be more fragile and just more expensive to test. And then this is a shout out to some of the new functionality that Salesforce is putting out there. Probably not that well known yet, but if you've heard the word UTAM, this is actually an automation model that is open source and being championed by Salesforce itself. There's actually a website that is linked to here that you can go and check out. And it actually is a Java and JSON based data object model. And it really looks like it could be the future of Salesforce object referencing. Right now, it is just on the Java side. I'm actually looking forward to hopefully one day there'll be some Python version of it. But basically, this is going to be, at least for the time being, and hopefully looking forward, this is going to be the way to generate objects within Salesforce, that Salesforce, even internally, is pushing forward with its teams to make sure that all those Lightning Web components and any kind of UI is going to have the standard reference. So definitely go check it out. I know some tools like ACCELQ are looking to integrate it into their frameworks as well. And just to provide a list of these for when you get this presentation, I try to put as many links as possible here at the end. Also want to do a special shout out. I used a few images from Salesforce.org's release engineering team and from their development teams in terms of NPSP repo, Cumulus CI. That's an open source tool, by the way, that is developed by those teams in-house at Salesforce and is used on some of the largest packages and managed packages out there. Thank you, and that wraps it up for today.